Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here.
So I want you to imagine something. Imagine you have just executed this brilliant, totally ruthless, hostile takeover of a massive corporation.
Okay, and I'm picturing it.
Right, and it's a profoundly corrupt company. So you come in, you fire the toxic board of directors, you root out all the embezzlement, and suddenly, you're hailed as the absolute hero of the hour.
The savior of the company.
Exactly. But then, and here's the catch, to solidify your new grip on power, you secretly adopt the exact same corrupt accounting practices that you just punished the old leadership for using.
Wow. Yeah, that's a pivot.
Right, and you justify it because, it keeps the shareholders happy, it secures the borders, whatever, it works. Today, we are looking at a 3,000-year-old manuscript that perfectly predicts this exact modern executive failure.
It really does. Along with, a dozen other psychological traps we fall into every single day.
Yeah, so that's what we're unpacking in this deep dive. We are plunging into 2 Kings, specifically chapters 9 through 17.
And it is a remarkable mirror. I mean, when you peer into these ancient chronicles of kings, I think a lot of people expect to find just a dusty ledger, battle dates, unpronounceable names.
Yeah, totally dry history.
Right. But instead you find this brutal, completely unfiltered autopsy of human ambition.
It's intense. These texts document the turbulent, fractured, and let's be honest, often bloody reigns of the ancient kings in the divided nations of Israel and Judah.
Very bloody.
But to really understand the mechanics of what's happening here, we aren't just reading the raw text. We're layering it with the insights of two of history's most comprehensive commentators, Matthew Henry and Albert Barnes.
And it is so vital to understand the lens those two men bring to the table.
Yeah, tell us about them.
Well, Matthew Henry was writing in England in the early 1700s, so he's living in the shadow of civil wars, political purges, massive institutional upheaval.
So he knows instability.
Exactly. And then Albert Barnes was writing in 19th century America, another era defined by intense national division and moral crisis.
The Civil War era, essentially.
Right. So these men, they were intimately familiar with the seduction of power and just how fragile human institutions actually are. They didn't view these ancient kings as mythical, untouchable figures.
Right. They saw them as case studies.
Case studies in human frailty, which makes them the perfect guides for us today.
It really does, because for you, the listener, the goal here is to extract the functional wisdom.
Yeah.
We are tracing this devastating, multi-generational arc.
Yeah, we're looking at how human beings start with incredible zeal, and then how we justify half measures.
And how we build our morality on, borrowed scaffolding.
Yes.
Yeah.
How we're blinded by our own success, and how we ultimately settle into these terrifyingly hollow, compromised lives.
So let's jump right in. We begin with a character who really embodies that explosive initial zeal. His name is Jehu.
Jehu, yeah. So we were in the northern kingdom of Israel. This is chapters 9 and 10.
Setting the scene.
Right. The prophet Elisha, who is nearing the end of his life at this point, sends a young protege to a military camp at Ramoth Gilead.
And it's a secret mission, right?
Very secret.
Yeah.
His mission is to pull this commander, Jehu, into a private room, anoint him as the new king, and give him a divine mandate.
And the mandate is intense.
It's extreme.
Yeah.
He is told to completely obliterate the reigning royal family, the deeply corrupt, murderous house of Ahaz.
It is just a phenomenal entrance into the narrative.
Yeah.
Because Jehu, he does not hesitate.
Not for a second.
No, he leaps into his chariot, he drives like an absolute madman to the city of Jezreel, and he initiates a total violent purge. I mean, he executes the reigning king Joram.
Yeah.
He executes the visiting king of Judah, Amaziah, just because he was allied with Ahab's family. And then, and this is the big one, he confronts the architect of so much of this corruption, the queen mother, Jezebel.
And that confrontation with Jezebel, it is one of the most stark, visceral scenes in all of ancient literature.
It really is. Paint that picture for us.
So she knows Jehu is coming. She knows her son is dead. The purge is happening. But she does not flee.
She doesn't run away.
No, and she doesn't hide either. The text tells us she literally paints her eyes, adorns her head, and looks out the upper window to taunt him as he arrives.
That is just, it's this desperate, chilling attempt to project, aesthetic dominance.
Exactly.
She's trying to maintain the illusion of power right up until the literal second she is thrown out of that window by her own eunuchs.
It's wild. And Matthew Henry isolates this profound psychological mechanism in that moment. He writes, and I quote, "There is not a surer presage of ruin than an unhumbled heart under humbling providences."
Wait, say that phrase again, an unhumbled heart.
Under humbling providences.
That is so good.
Yeah. Henry goes on to say, "Let painted faces look in Jezebel's glass and see how they like themselves." He's pointing out that her aesthetic preparation was just this act of supreme delusion.
Right. Because reality is collapsing around her.
Exactly. When reality is collapsing, applying a veneer of control is the ultimate symptom of a hardened, doomed psychology. I mean, she is trampled under the horses.
Yeah, it's a brutal end.
And later, when Jehu's men go to actually bury her, they find almost nothing left. The stray dogs have consumed her, which perfectly fulfills a prophecy made years earlier by Elijah.
I am still stuck on Henry's phrase, though. An unhumbled heart under humbling providences. I mean, think about how often we do exactly that today.
Oh, all the time.
We face a massive career failure or, maybe our marriage is falling apart. And instead of engaging in the deeply humbling work of introspection,
we meticulously curate our LinkedIn profile.
Yes. Or we post these heavily filtered vacation photos on Instagram. We paint our faces and look out the window, pretending we're still royalty, while the chariot is literally pulling up to the gate.
It's the human reflex, isn't it? To try to control the narrative when we can no longer control the reality.
Totally. But the complexity of this whole narrative, it really centers on Jehu himself.
Right, because after Jezebel, he systematically eliminates all 70 of Ahab's sons in Samaria. He terrifies their guardians into beheading them.
70 sons.
Yeah. Then he orchestrates this massive fake religious festival for the priests of Baal, lures them all into their temple, and slaughters every single one of them. He completely eradicates the systemic idolatry and persecution that had plagued the nation.
Okay, I have to stop here and just push back on the text a bit because this is a massive hurdle for modern readers.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Jehu acts like a butcher. I mean, I understand he has this divine mandate to execute judgment, but the sheer scale of the deception and the bloodshed?
Yeah.
How are we supposed to view this as righteous reform?
It's tough.
It feels like we're validating purely selfish, psychopathic ambition just because it happened to align with a prophesied outcome. Like, where is the line?
And that tension is exactly what makes the text a masterclass in discernment. Matthew Henry addresses this head on, actually.
Oh, he does.
He does. And he forces us to separate the mechanism of justice from the motivation of the executioner.
Okay, break that down for me.
So, the house of Ahab was guilty of systemic generational bloodshed. They had slaughtered innocent people. They killed the prophets of God. God's controversy with them was primarily about innocent blood.
Right. They were a brutally oppressive regime.
Exactly. So Jehu is the blunt instrument of that specific localized justice. But, and this is the crucial distinction Henry makes, just because you are a tool of justice does not mean your heart is just.
So you can do the right thing for entirely the wrong reasons.
Precisely. Jehu's internal motivation is heavily scrutinized by the commentators. He is driven by bloodlust and ego.
And the text actually shows us that, doesn't it?
It exposes it perfectly. There's this moment when Jehu is riding to Samaria, and he encounters Jehonadab, this man who is widely known and respected for his strict piety.
Like a major religious influencer of the time.
Exactly. Jehu pulls this respected guy up into his chariot and says, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord."
Oh, wow. That changes everything. He wants an audience.
He demands the applause. Henry zeroes in on that boast. A truly upright heart, Henry argues, seeks only the quiet acceptance of its own conscience and the approval of the divine.
It doesn't need a PR campaign.
Right. It doesn't need a PR campaign. Jehu is aiming at the applause of men. He wanted Jehonadab in the chariot as a mascot of legitimacy to validate his violence. He was making his own glory his highest end, just cloaking his ambition in the language of religious zeal.
Which perfectly explains the great tragic pivot of Jehu's life. I mean, he roots out Baal, he cleans house, but then the text delivers this devastating line. It says, "But Jehu departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin."
Yep, the golden calves.
Right. He kept the golden calves at the cities of Dan and Bethel. And you just have to ask, if he was so incredibly zealous for pure worship, why on earth did he leave these massive idols standing?
Because of border control and political leverage.
Geopolitics.
Exactly. Generations earlier, King Jeroboam had set up those golden calves specifically to prevent the citizens of the northern kingdom from traveling south to Jerusalem.
Which was in the rival kingdom of Judah.
Right. Jerusalem had the main temple. Jeroboam feared that if his people went south for religious festivals, their political loyalties would eventually shift, and they would overthrow him.
Wow.
It was a purely geopolitical strategy disguised as a religious alternative.
So Jehu eliminated the worship of Baal because it cost him absolutely nothing politically. In fact, it consolidated his power, right? It removed the previous regime's loyalists.
Exactly. It was a win-win for his ambition.
But he kept the golden calves because they were profitable. They kept his citizens locked inside his economic and political borders. It's like he's pruning the diseased branches of a tree to look like a hero, but he is intentionally leaving the toxic roots in the ground because they happen to be holding his retaining wall together.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Henry calls this the ultimate test of true conversion. Real transformation isn't just abandoning the vices that are socially unpopular or physically destructive.
Right. It's easy to stop doing things everyone already hates.
Exactly. True transformation is abandoning the gainful sins. It is dismantling the compromises that directly support your secular interests but rot your core integrity. Jehu was a pragmatist masquerading as a purist.
That is a brutal mirror. I mean, it asks a deeply uncomfortable question of you, the listener, right now. What is the golden calf in your professional or personal life?
The tough question to face.
Because we are often very quick to eliminate the obvious bells, right? We quit drinking too much, we stop yelling at our employees, we clean up the toxic behaviors that threaten our public reputation.
Sure, the stuff that looks bad on paper.
But where is that ethical gray area you refuse to touch because it is just too profitable? Maybe it's a deceptive marketing practice that drives your sales, or, I don't know, a relationship you maintain solely for social leverage even though it requires you to compromise your values.
Yeah, you tell yourself you are a person of integrity, but you are carefully managing a half measure.
And the text warns us that half measures eventually trigger a full collapse. Because Jehu's foundation was fractured, the kingdom began to lose territory. God cuts Israel short, they start losing their borders to Syria.
Which initiates this organic pivot in our narrative. Because while this geopolitical and spiritual rot is taking hold in the northern kingdom of Israel, an equally terrifying yet deeply instructive narrative is unfolding down in the southern kingdom of Judah.
Right, this brings us to chapters 11 and 12, the story of Queen Athaliah, the boy King Joash, and the priest Jehoiada.
If you want to study the psychology of power and just paranoid survival, Athaliah is the ultimate case study.
She is terrifying.
Truly. She is actually the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, who was married into the royal family of Judah. And when she receives word that her son, King Amaziah, has been killed in Jehu's purge up north, she doesn't mourn.
No tears at all.
None. She seizes the political vacuum.
Yeah.
And to ensure absolutely no one can challenge her usurpation, she orders the execution of the entire royal seed.
Her own grandchildren. She initiates a systematic slaughter of her own lineage to ensure she has zero rivals to the throne. The sheer psychological horror of a grandmother doing this is staggering.
It's really hard to fathom. Henry points out the unnatural, chilling depth of this ambition. He says she is driven by a thirst for absolute rule, yes, but also a furious, retaliatory spirit against the divine promises that favored the line of David.
She's trying to wipe out the promise.
Exactly. She is attempting to completely sever the historical and theological continuity of an entire nation.
But the narrative hinges on a single act of profound, terrifying courage. Jehosheba, who is the sister of the dead king, slips into the chaos of the royal nursery and steals away a single infant boy named Joash.
Just one baby.
Just one. She and her husband, the high priest Jehoiada, hide this baby and his nurse in a forgotten secret chamber of the temple.
For 6 years.
For 6 agonizing years. While Athaliah unleashes this reign of terror and tyranny across the land, the rightful heir to the throne is growing up in complete silence, hidden just yards away from the palace.
There is a powerful, recurring human truth embedded in that historical detail.
What's that?
Well, throughout history, whenever tyranny or corruption or just utter madness seems to capture the culture entirely, the truth is often driven underground.
It goes into hiding.
Right. It doesn't vanish. It is merely preserved in the hidden spaces by faithful custodians. The commentators note the profound tension here. The ancient, sweeping promise that the lineage of David would endure was, for 6 years, hanging by a thread, bound up entirely in the fragile lungs of a hidden toddler.
That puts so much weight on Jehoiada and Jehosheba. They aren't just babysitting, they are guarding the final ember of their civilization's future.
The pressure must have been immense.
And when the boy turns 7, Jehoiada decides it is finally time to strike. But he doesn't just, run out into the courtyard holding a pid and yelling.
No, he orchestrates a meticulous, masterful coup.
He quietly brings the military captains into the temple. He shows them the boy. He swears them to a covenant. And he utilizes the natural rhythm of the temple guards changing shifts on the Sabbath to quietly double his armed force.
The logistical brilliance of it is amazing. And it's matched by a deeply symbolic choice. Yeah. Jehoiada arms these captains with King David's old spears and shields, which had been stored in the temple for generations.
Oh, I love that detail.
Henry highlights it beautifully. These weapons were probably antique, perhaps practically outdated for combat, but their psychological weight was immense.
It's like handing them Excalibur.
Exactly. Putting David's shields in the hands of these men connected their immediate treasonous danger to a deep, stabilizing historical purpose. It reminded them of who they were fighting for.
So they bring the boy out, they crown him, hand him the book of the law, and the temple erupts in applause. Athaliah hears the commotion, rushes into the temple, sees the 7-year-old boy standing by the royal pillar, and she violently tears her clothes and screams, "Treason! Treason!"
To which the commentators dryly, but very accurately observe, those who are themselves the most guilty are always the first to project their crimes onto others.
Oh, 100%.
She, the ultimate usurper and murderer, cries treason when justice finally arrives. She is immediately escorted out of the sacred precincts and executed.
So the tyranny is broken, the young king is installed. And as Joash grows into adulthood, he looks around at the temple he was raised in, and he realizes it is in ruins. Athaliah's regime had vandalized it, stripped it of its dedicated items to serve foreign gods, and just left it to decay. So Joash initiates a massive repair project.
And here we transition from the drama of the coup to the grinding mechanics of systemic repair.
The unglamorous part.
Very unglamorous. Joash orders the priests to go out to the cities and collect the required funds to rebuild the temple. But years pass, and nothing happens.
Crickets.
Right. The priests are either incompetent, apathetic, or perhaps skimming the funds. We don't really know. But the repairs stall completely. The old bureaucratic pipes are entirely rusted shut.
So Jehoiada, who is still advising the king, realizes they need a radically different mechanism. So he invents something entirely new. He takes a large chest, bores a hole in the lid, and places it right beside the altar.
Essentially the first recorded drop box in history.
Right. The people bring their money, drop it directly into the chest, and completely bypass the priests. The royal scribes then bag up the money and hand it straight to the carpenters, the masons, and the stonecutters.
It is an incredible organizational pivot. They remove the friction and the opacity of the middlemen. And the text makes a point of stating that they did not even require an accounting from the foremen who managed the money because they dealt faithfully.
When you establish a clear, direct mission and remove the bureaucratic bloat, you empower trust.
You really do.
It is brilliant. But this entire story of Joash, his miraculous survival, the brilliant coup, the innovative rebuilding of the temple, it all sets up one of the most tragic psychological pivots in the entire text.
How does Joash's story end?
It ends in total collapse.
Yeah.
And the text gives us the exact mechanism of that collapse in a single qualifying phrase. It says that Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all his days, wherein Jehoiada the priest instructed him.
That is a terrifying caveat, wherein Jehoiada instructed him. It is the tragedy of borrowed convictions. As long as Jehoiada was alive, providing the moral scaffolding, Joash was a righteous, effective king. He leaned entirely on his mentor's integrity.
But the moment his mentor dies...
The moment Jehoiada dies, Joash is surrounded by the corrupt princes of Judah, who flatter him and push him toward idolatry, and Joash instantly caves.
He didn't just bend, he broke entirely. When King Hazael of Syria marches toward Jerusalem, threatening to destroy the city, Joash completely panics.
Complete panic.
Instead of relying on the God whose temple he just spent years crowdsourcing to repair, Joash takes all the hallowed gold, the very gold he worked so hard to gather, strips it out of the temple, and sends it to Hazael as a bribe to make him go away.
He dismantles his own life's work in a single moment of terror.
And eventually his own servants assassinate him in his bed.
The psychological insight here is devastating. Joash never internalized the values he was championing. He wore Jehoiada's morality like a rented suit.
A rented suit, wow.
When the mentor vanished, the king's true, hollow nature was exposed by the pressure of Hazael's army. Borrowed convictions cannot survive a siege.
Let's pull this into the present for a moment, because this is an incredibly common phenomenon. We surround ourselves with brilliant mentors, we listen to the right deep dives, we read the right philosophy, we adopt the cultural ethics of a high-performing company or a deeply moral peer group.
We look like we have it all together.
Right, because our environment is holding us up. But what happens when you lose your job, or you move to a new city, or a crisis hits and your mentor isn't there to tell you what to do?
The scaffolding comes down.
Exactly. If your moral compass isn't anchored internally, the moment the Hazael of your life shows up, a financial crisis, a terrifying diagnosis, a massive temptation, you will strip the gold right off your own values to buy temporary relief.
It is a profound call for an internal audit. You have to ask yourself, are the principles I claim to live by truly mine, forged in the fires of my own wrestling with truth? Or am I just outsourcing my integrity to the people around me?
If the scaffolding of your current social or professional circle was stripped away tomorrow, would your character remain standing?
That is a heavy, necessary reflection.
It really is. And it perfectly sets up our next major theme. Because if Joash in the south failed because he had no internal foundation, we see another king, ironically also named Joash but ruling in the northern kingdom of Israel, fail for a different but equally internal reason.
Yes. We are moving to chapter 13 and the final moments of the great prophet Elisha.
Set the scene for us here.
So this is one of the most vivid, cinematic, and honestly strange encounters in the historical record. Elisha, who has been this towering, almost terrifying figure of spiritual authority and national defense for over half a century, is finally on his deathbed.
He's old, he's sick.
He is old and sick. King Joash of Israel comes down to the prophet's bedside. He weeps over Elisha's face and cries out, "Oh, my father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof."
Now, he is quoting the exact same words Elisha used decades earlier when his own mentor, Elijah, was taken away in a whirlwind. So it sounds like a beautiful moment of reverence.
It sounds reverent, yes, but Henry suggests it is deeply pragmatic and somewhat selfish.
How so?
Joash is weeping not just for the loss of a holy man, but for the loss of his primary military asset. The northern kingdom was constantly being battered by the Syrian army. They were poor in literal chariots and horsemen, so Elisha's prophetic foresight and spiritual protection had been their main bulwark.
The king is panicking because his human shield is dying.
Exactly. But Elisha doesn't offer him comforting platitudes. He turns this deathbed visit into a bizarre physical test.
This is where it gets weird.
Very weird. He tells the king to get a bow and some arrows. He tells him to open the eastern window, the window facing their enemy, Syria. Then Elisha, with his weak, dying hands, reaches out and places his hands over the king's hands as he draws the bow. Elisha says, "Shoot," and the king fires the arrow out the window. Elisha declares it, "The arrow of the Lord's deliverance from Syria."
It is an incredibly potent symbol.
It is. Henry interprets the layering of the hands beautifully. God would be the agent, but the king must be the instrument. Divine power does not negate human effort. It operates through it.
But the symbol only sets up the real test, right?
Right. Elisha then commands the king to take the remaining bundle of arrows and smite upon the ground. The king strikes the ground 3 times and then he stops.
And Elisha loses his mind.
He goes ballistic.
The dying prophet is absolutely furious. He yells at the king, saying he should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times because then he would have utterly consumed Syria. But because he only struck 3 times, he will only defeat Syria 3 times.
Yep.
Now wait, let's look at the mechanics of this because I have always struggled with this passage. Isn't this an entirely unfair test?
A lot of people think that.
It's like testing an employee without giving them the rubric. Elisha didn't say strike 5 times, he just said strike. It feels like Elisha is setting a trap or projecting his own frustration onto a king who is just trying to obey a weird, ambiguous request.
That is the most common and frankly logical modern reaction. But the commentators argue that we are misinterpreting the nature of the request. This wasn't a guessing game where the king had to magically intuit a secret number.
Okay, what was it then?
It was a psychological and spiritual stress test of the king's internal drive. The act of striking the ground with the arrows of deliverance was meant to physically embody his desire, his passion, and his relentless pursuit of total victory over the forces oppressing his people.
And he didn't show that passion.
Not at all. Henry suggests that the king likely struck the ground coldly, perhaps feeling embarrassed. He thought it was a silly, childish pantomime for a monarch to be beating the floor with sticks in front of a dying man. He gave it 3 lazy taps just to humor the old prophet, and then he stopped.
So the fury wasn't about the number itself. The number was just a metric of his zeal. He stopped because he didn't actually care that much.
Exactly. He lacked the internal flame.
Yeah.
He was not straitened or restricted by the limits of divine power or the promise of victory. He was restricted by his own abysmal expectations and his lack of relentless drive.
He just did the bare minimum.
He did the absolute bare minimum required for compliance. He stopped when the friction of the moment felt slightly awkward or tiring, rather than grabbing the opportunity to secure a total, absolute victory.
That reframes the entire story, and it is a terrifying mirror for how we operate. I mean, think about how often we start an endeavor. We want to master a difficult skill. We want to heal a deeply broken relationship. Or we are trying to build a business.
We're all fired up at the start.
Right. We get the initial guidance, we fire that first arrow out the window, and we feel great. But then comes the grind. We were told to strike the ground. We have to do the repetitive, unglamorous, exhausting work of actually securing the victory.
The daily striking.
And what do? We strike the ground 3 times. We put in a little effort. We hit the first plateau of good enough. And then we just quit. We coast. We lose the ultimate victory, not because the goal was impossible, but because we lacked the relentless, unreasonable drive to push all the way through the friction. We settle for partial deliverance.
We are defeated by our own willingness to settle. The king didn't truly believe in the necessity of total victory, or he simply wasn't willing to exert the energy required to imagine it. And the historical consequence was exact. He had some military success, but the Syrian threat remained, ultimately continuing to bleed his nation.
So if you are listening to this, identify a specific arena in your life right now. Maybe it's a massive project at work, a physical health journey, or a commitment you made to your family. Are you just humoring the process? Are you giving it 3 polite taps because that's what is expected of you?
Just checking the box.
Right. Or are you striking the ground with the vigor, the passion, and the sustained, aggressive effort required to actually win? Do not stop at 3 strikes when the situation demands 6.
It is a brilliant psychological pivot. We have seen what happens when you settle and quit early, but the narrative doesn't let us rest there. It immediately asks the invert question. What happens when you don't quit?
What happens when you win?
Exactly. What happens when you strike the ground, you fight hard, and you actually achieve massive, undeniable success?
It turns out that might be the most dangerous trap of all, which brings us to chapters 14 and 15 and the hubris of success. We are pivoting back to the southern kingdom of Judah to look at 2 kings, Amaziah and his son Uzziah.
Let's begin with Amaziah. He actually starts his reign with a profound act of ethical restraint. His father, Joash, the one who caved and was assassinated, was murdered by his own servants. When Amaziah takes the throne, he rightfully executes the assassins, but crucially, he refuses to execute the assassins' children.
Which, in the ancient Near East, was standard operating procedure. If you killed a traitor, you wiped out his entire bloodline so nobody could grow up and seek revenge. It was ruthless, but it was politically prudent.
Yes. But Amaziah adheres strictly to the law of Moses, specifically Deuteronomy 24, which mandated that fathers shall not be put to death for the children, nor children for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin.
He actually follows the law.
He does. Barnes and Henry both highlight this as a revolutionary application of individual justice in a brutal collective punishment world. Amaziah takes a massive political risk to do the right ethical thing.
And it seems he is rewarded for that integrity. He builds a massive army, he marches against the nation of Edom, and he wins a crushing historic victory in the Valley of Salt. He captures their chief fortress city. He is a conqueror. He is riding higher than any king in recent memory.
But
then his brain tricks him. He experiences what we might call the delusion of competence. He has won this major victory, and suddenly he feels invincible. Drunk on his own success against Edom, Amaziah sends a messenger to Jehoash, the king of Israel in the north, and says, "Come, let us look one another in the face."
Which is ancient diplomatic code for, bring your army, let's go to war.
Square up. It is pure, unprovoked aggression born entirely of arrogance. He has no legitimate grievance with Israel. He just wants another trophy.
And the response he gets from the king of Israel is a masterpiece of ancient rhetoric. Albert Barnes points out that Jehoash uses a classic Oriental apologue, a short fable used to deliver a crushing, humiliating insult.
I love this part. Tell the fable.
Jehoiash sends a message back saying, "The thistle that was in Lebanon sent to the cedar that was in Lebanon, saying, 'Give thy daughter to my son to wife.' and there passed by a wild beast that was in Lebanon and trode down the thistle.
Oh, man. It's such a savage put down. He is comparing his own kingdom to a majestic, towering, deeply rooted cedar tree, and he is comparing Amaziah to a useless, thorny, fragile little weed that is about to get mindlessly stepped on by a passing animal.
And Jehoash doesn't leave the fable to interpretation. He explicitly diagnoses Amaziah's psychological state. He says, "Thou hast indeed smitten Edom, and thine heart has lifted thee up. Glory of this, and tarry at home. For why shouldest thou meddle to thy hurt?"
Carry it home. Just stay home.
Right. Matthew Henry elaborates beautifully on this phrase, "Thine heart hath lifted thee up." Henry notes that the root of this disaster wasn't the victory over Edom itself. It was Amaziah's internal interpretation of that victory. He allowed a circumstantial triumph to rewrite his entire self-concept.
Jehoash is giving him an out. He's saying, you got to win, be proud of it, take your trophy, go home and sit down.
But Amaziah is completely blinded by his ego. He refuses to listen. He forces the battle, and it is an unmitigated disaster.
Total rout.
His army is routed, he is taken prisoner, and the king of Israel marches his army right up to Jerusalem, tears down 400 cubits of the city's defensive wall, and plunders all the gold and silver from the temple. Amaziah loses his security, his wealth, and his dignity, because his ego wrote a check that his actual capabilities could not cash.
And the tragic comparative insight here is that this is not an isolated incident. We see the exact same neurobiological trap spring on his son Azariah, who is also known as Uzziah.
Uzziah takes the throne and reigns for 52 years. The historical chronicles tell us he was an absolute prodigy of statecraft.
He was a genius.
Truly. He built cities, he developed massive agricultural systems, he fielded heavily armored armies, and he even had engineers invent new projectile weapons for the walls of Jerusalem. He was wildly successful.
Yeah.
But eventually, just like his father, his success calcifies into dangerous pride.
He decides that being the supreme political and military leader isn't enough. He wants absolute control across all domains. So he marches into the temple, usurping the role specifically reserved for the consecrated priests, and attempts to burn incense on the altar himself.
He violates the most sacred boundary of his culture because he believes his secular success grants him universal jurisdiction. He thinks he's the exception to every rule.
The ultimate arrogance.
And for this presumptuous invasion of the sacred space, the text says God strikes him with leprosy right there beside the altar. The consequence is devastating. This incredibly powerful, famous, industrious man is forced to spend the rest of his life isolated in a separate house, cut off from all society and administration, while his son acts as regent.
Henry has a quote on this, right?
Yes. Henry notes the profound mortification of this end. It was a great mortification to one that had been so much a man of honor and a man of business, to be cut off from society.
It is the delusion of competence transferring across domains. We see this constantly today. Someone builds a brilliant, successful tech startup, and suddenly they believe they are an expert on epidemiology, macroeconomics, and foreign policy.
The halo effect of success.
Exactly. Success creates a psychological feedback loop where you only hear your own echo. You think, I was right about the software market, therefore I am right about everything, and anyone who questions me is just a hater. You become the thistle trying to intermarry with the cedar.
Success is often a worse teacher than failure. Failure forces introspection. Success encourages expansion, often beyond our actual capacity.
So how do you handle a win? That is the question you have to ask yourself. When you secure that massive promotion, when you hit the sales target, when your creative project goes viral, do you have a mechanism to keep your ego tethered to reality?
You need an anchor.
You do. The practice here is to establish a personal grounding ritual. You need truth tellers in your life who are unimpressed by your resume. You must consciously fight to maintain the humility of a learner, rather than adopting the arrogant posture of the untouchable. Because the moment you believe you are untouchable, you are wandering right into the path of the wild beast.
That is a vital warning. It prepares us for the final and undoubtedly the most devastating descent in our deep dive. We are moving into chapters 16 and 17.
This is where it gets really dark.
We have seen half measures, we have seen borrowed convictions, and we have seen the hubris of success. Now, we witness what happens when fear drives a leader and a nation to completely commodify their deepest values.
This is where the wheels completely fall off the wagon. In Judah, we have King Ahaz. He is facing a terrifying geopolitical threat. The kings of Syria and Israel have formed an alliance and are marching against Jerusalem.
A massive existential threat.
And Ahaz is completely gripped by panic. Instead of turning to the God of his ancestors or even attempting to rally his military for a brave defense, Ahaz totally capitulates to a third party. He strips the temple treasury, taking all the dedicated gold and silver, and sends it to Tiglath-Pileser, the brutal, expanding king of Assyria.
The worst guy on the block.
Right. And Ahaz's message to him is sickeningly subservient. He says, "I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me." He literally sells his nation's sovereignty and dignity to buy a temporary reprieve from fear.
Matthew Henry is utterly scathing in his assessment of this moment. He writes, "If the prodigal forsake his father's house, he soon becomes a slave to the worst of masters."
Wow.
Yeah. Ahaz impoverishes his kingdom to hire a bodyguard who will inevitably become his warden. But the political and financial enslavement is only the first layer of the tragedy. The spiritual and cultural bankruptcy that follows is astonishing.
Ahaz goes up to Damascus to officially meet and bow before his new Assyrian overlord. While he is there, he sees a massive, elaborate pagan altar. And he is utterly captivated by it, not because of its theology, but because of its aesthetics.
It looks cool.
It looks like power. It looks like the empire that just saved him. So he draws up detailed blueprints of this pagan altar, sends them back to his head priest, Urijah, in Jerusalem, and orders him to build an exact replica.
It is the ultimate pragmatic descent. When Ahaz returns, he takes the bronze altar of God, the functional, divinely ordained centerpiece of their worship that had been used for centuries, and shoves it off to the side.
Just pushes it into a corner.
Exactly. He places his shiny new replica in the center of the temple courtyard and declares that all the primary national sacrifices will now be offered on this imported Assyrian-style altar.
He re-engineers the core identity of his nation just to mimic the style of the empire he submitted to. It's like a failing company abandoning its core, high-quality product to pump out cheap knockoffs of their competitors' flashy, soulless gadget just because they are desperate for relevance.
That's a perfect analogy.
And the saddest part is what he says about the old original altar. He tells the priest, "The brazen altar shall be for me to inquire by."
Yes. He treats the sacred ancient altar as nothing more than a personal magic 8-ball.
A divination tool.
Right. He uses it for his own emergencies, while the public cultural worship is entirely surrendered to the aesthetic of his conquerors. It is the complete commodification of his faith. He keeps a piece of his heritage only for its perceived utility, stripping it of all its reverence.
It makes my stomach turn. But while Judah is slowly poisoning itself through this cultural compromise under Ahaz, the northern kingdom of Israel finally hits the absolute end of the road. Chapter 17 details the ultimate catastrophic judgment falling on Samaria.
The patience of God, which the text portrays as stretching over centuries and dozens of prophetic warnings, finally runs out. The Assyrian army besieges Samaria, captures it, and initiates a massive, brutal deportation.
The 10 tribes are gone.
The 10 tribes of Israel are ripped from their land and exiled into the Assyrian Empire, effectively erasing them from the map as a sovereign entity. But the author of Kings does not just record the historical fact of the exile. He pauses the narrative to provide a devastating, meticulous spiritual autopsy of the nation. He explains exactly why this happened.
And it is a comprehensive indictment. Barnes and Henry both point out that the text leaves no room for excuses. Why were they destroyed? The text says they secretly did things that were not right. They built high places, pagan shrines in every single settlement, from the smallest watchman's tower to the largest fortified city.
It was everywhere.
They stubbornly rejected the warnings of every single prophet sent to correct them. But worst of all, they became completely assimilated into the toxic, destructive culture surrounding them, to the point where they were literally passing their own children through the fire.
Child sacrifice.
They adopted child sacrifice. They sacrificed their own future to appease the imaginary gods of their neighbors. It is a total moral collapse.
Which leads to a fascinating, deeply instructive geopolitical aftermath. The Assyrians didn't just leave the land of Israel empty. They utilized a policy of forced resettlement to prevent rebellions. They brought in foreigners from Babylon, Cutha, Hamath, and various other conquered regions, and transplanted them into the empty cities of Samaria.
So you have this melting pot of foreign refugees suddenly living in the ruins of Israel. But then something strange happens. The text says that because these new settlers did not fear the Lord, God sent lions among them, which started killing some of the people.
And in the ancient mindset, deities were deeply territorial. You worshiped the god of the specific dirt you were standing on.
So these settlers panic. They assume the god of the land is angry because they don't know the proper local rituals to appease him. They send a desperate message to the king of Assyria, begging for help.
The king of Assyria's solution is highly pragmatic. He finds one of the Israelite priests who had been deported, and he sends him back to Samaria to teach these new settlers the manner of the god of the land.
But we have to remember the context. This priest isn't a faithful, holy priest from the temple in Jerusalem. He is almost certainly one of the corrupt priests from Bethel, the ones who worshiped the golden calves that Jehu left behind.
Exactly.
So this compromised priest goes back and teaches them a compromised version of the religion. And the result is an absolute chaotic mess.
It results in what Matthew Henry famously and accurately calls a mongrel religion. The text summarizes the situation with one of the most chilling, paradoxical sentences in the entire historical record, it says. They feared the Lord and served their own gods.
That is profound.
The Babylonians continued to worship their Babylonian gods. The men of Hamath worshipped theirs, and they set up their idols in the shrines on the hills. But simultaneously, they went through the motions of the Israelite rituals. They added the God of Israel to their pantheon strictly as an insurance policy.
They feared the Lord and served their own gods. Let's look at the mechanics of that. They feared the lions, so they performed the rituals to keep the danger at bay. But their hearts, their actual devotion and love, were entirely reserved for the idols they brought with them from their old lives.
It's transactional.
It is, and that is incredibly modern. Think about how we approach wellness or morality or even spirituality today. We mix this superficial mindfulness with an absolutely ruthless hustle culture.
Oh, absolutely.
We download the meditation app, we go on the silent retreat, we talk endlessly about being centered and grounded because we are terrified. The lions of burnout, anxiety, and heart disease are attacking us. We want the physical and mental relief that comes from spiritual disciplines.
But at our core, in our actual operating system, we are still fiercely serving the relentless gods of status, wealth, ego, and continuous upward mobility.
It is the exact same mechanism. They use the rituals of truth as a utility, a shield against immediate physical danger. But they refuse to surrender their ultimate allegiance. Henry points out the tragic absurdity of this state. You are checking the boxes of religious or moral obligation, but your internal operating system remains entirely pagan. You are trying to serve two masters, which means you are deeply fractured.
It is the ultimate mixed religion.
Okay.
We want the benefits of a moral, peaceful, grounded life, but we absolutely refuse to let go of the idolatry of our own ambition. And the result is that we become an incredibly anxious, hollow people, just going through the motions to keep the lions away while worshiping our bank accounts in secret.
So here is the final audit for you to run on your own life. In what specific areas are you attempting to run a mongrel religion? Where are you checking the boxes of ethics or wellness or faith strictly out of fear? Fear of the consequences, fear of losing your reputation, fear of the lions, while in secret you reserve your true love, your deepest time, and your ultimate devotion for your personal idols.
If we synthesize this entire journey through these ancient texts, we see a terrifyingly clear, progressive pattern of human degradation. It rarely happens all at once.
It's a slow fade.
It is. It begins with the zeal of Jehu, which masks a fatal willingness to accept half measures, cleansing the visible corruption but keeping the golden calves of convenience.
Right.
That structural weakness leads to the fragility of Joash, who builds a successful life entirely on borrowed convictions, only to collapse the moment his mentor's scaffolding is removed.
And then we see the tragedy of King Joash of Israel,
Who settles for mediocrity because he lacks the internal fire to strike the ground until the victory is complete.
and the inverse trap with Amaziah and Uzziah.
Right, where massive success morphs into the hubris of the untouchable, blinding them to their own limitations and destroying their legacy.
And it all culminates in the pragmatic descent of Ahaz in Samaria, where fear drives a superficial aesthetic compliance, creating a mongrel compromise where the heart remains entirely enslaved to its own desires.
It's a heavy stack of sources today.
It is. It is dense, it is challenging, and frankly, it is a harsh mirror, but it is necessary. Because these are not just the chronicles of long-dead kings ruling over forgotten dust. They are architectural blueprints of human failure. They warn us about the exact traps we are setting for ourselves right now.
Exactly.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to carry into your week. If your life was examined 100 years from now, chronicled with the same unfiltered, brutal honesty as the kings of Judah and Israel, what would the record show?
That's the real question.
Would history reveal that you were a cedar, deeply rooted in enduring truth, operating from a core of unborrowed conviction? Or would the autopsy show that you were a thistle, easily trampled by the wild beasts of circumstance because you built your foundation on the shifting mongrel sands of whatever was convenient and profitable at the time? That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.